used to do a lot of solo survival stuff during the wintertime, and this is the story of my final trip before I decided it wasn't such a good idea anymore. It was midwinter, the ground was almost frozen solid, and there was a slight dusting of snow on the ground. It was cold, but it was a dry kind of cold, which, from experience, is the best you can ask for. I've been walking through the woods for hours, armed with my shotgun while looking for birds and not really having any luck. And then after about another hour of walking, the trees thinned out and I came across a valley. It wasn't part of the plan, but it looked like a decent enough shortcut, a narrow trail cutting through a ravine, leading to another clearing on the other side. The day was getting late, and I didn't want to waste time circling around, and since the slope down looked steep but manageable, I figured, why the hell not? I started down, my boots crunching in the frost, but making my way down without slipping made for much slower going than I first thought. And the longer I took, the darker it got. As the walls of the ravine rose up either side of me and the trees and the shadows closed in, I felt the cold getting into my bones. But it wasn't just the cold giving me a chill. Something about this place felt wrong. And that's when I saw him. He was standing still as a statue in the middle of the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead of me. He had some kind of civilian AR in his hands, held at the ready like he was waiting for something. And when I saw him, I froze. He didn't look like any kind of camper or hiker I'd ever seen. His clothes were filthy, layers of mismatched jackets and pants that barely hung on his skinny frame. He was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days, and those eyes were just sunken and very dark, and they immediately locked on me in a way that made my stomach twist into a knot. At that moment, I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't listen. I still had my shotgun on my shoulder, and I could feel it slipping a little. The thought of it slipping off of my shoulder filled me with a kind of dread I'd never felt before, because I thought, if that happens, he might think I'm trying to aim it at him, at which point he might just be skittish enough to open fire on me, and not wait and see if I'm just some dumb idiot who let his gun slip from his shoulder. Slowly, I adjusted the strap of my shotgun, careful to make my movements deliberate and non-threatening. The armed man still didn't move, and the air felt heavy. It was almost pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, anything, but my whole mouth felt like it went and locked up on me, and I forced myself to take a step back and then another, watching him watch me. I didn't run. I knew that'd be a bad idea. Every step I took was slow, deliberate, and the crunch of my boots in the snow sounded almost too loud. The man didn't follow, but he made his presence felt, and it was like I could still feel his eyes on me even after the trail curved and I could no longer see him. When I finally made it out of the valley, the cold seemed to lift and the world felt normal again. I didn't stop moving until I was far enough away to consider it a safe distance, but even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, watching me from the trees. That night, sitting by the fire, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. Deer season wasn't open. AR-15s aren't legal for hunting around here, and he didn't look like a hunter. Hell, he didn't even look like he belonged out there at all. He seemed to me more like a man who hadn't been part of the world in a long time. Such a long time that something else had taken his place. The next morning, I drove into town and reported it to the sheriff, who listened, nodded, and then said they'd check it out. And weeks went by, and I never heard back from him. And I haven't gone back to that valley since. I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't hunting deer or anything else. Whoever was down there didn't want me in that valley, and I'm only too happy to oblige him. I've always enjoyed winter camping, the kinds of trips that really push you to your limits and force you to embrace the cold and silence of the frozen wilderness. Last winter, I decided to go on a solo trip deep into north-central Pennsylvania. The area I picked out was so remote that getting there would require an hour-long drive down dirt Forest Service roads, followed by a 6-mile hike along a barely visible trail. There wasn't a soul around, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone. The quiet, snow-covered forest was exactly what I was looking for. The trail was rough, overgrown in places and barely recognizable as a path. I had to push through dense, wet brush, and there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been there recently. It felt like the kind of place that only those looking to truly escape the world would find. The trail followed a creek down a rocky valley, which didn't make for an easy hike, let me assure you. and the terrain was steep and uneven with ice patches and thick snow covering the rocks, making each step a careful decision. But the beauty of the place, the stillness, the quiet, crisp air, it was well worth the effort. I had no specific destination in mind. I was just wandering through the woods, hoping to find a good spot to set up camp. As the sun began to set and the temperature drastically dropped, I came to a fork in the creek. On the other side, there was a section of relatively flat land that looked perfect for a campsite, and I carefully crossed the creek, stepping cautiously on the slippery rocks, and then started to investigate the area. Scattered across the snow were signs that someone had been there recently. A tarp was spread out on the ground next to a stone fire ring, and nearby a log, about a foot in diameter, had been chopped in half so cleanly that it had to be with some kind of axe or blade. I moved closer, inspecting the area more carefully. A pile of gear immediately stood out. There were food wrappers, a small cooking set, a camping pad, and a first aid kit, and everything someone might need for a winter camping trip. All of it was just left behind, carelessly discarded as if someone had just walked away from it. I continued exploring, more irritated at this person's carelessness more than anything, and until I found the clothes. They were piled by the creek, damp from the last rainstorm that had passed through the day before, and they weren't wet enough to be fresh, but they hadn't dried out properly either. They sat there, almost as if abandoned, with a towel draped over a nearby branch, still damp and heavy with moisture from the night before. Then, as I walked a bit further, I came across something that truly disturbed me. There was an area near the creek, clearly used as a toilet. Piles of toilet paper, some stained with brown and others with remnants of urine, were scattered across the ground. It wasn't just one or two pieces either. It was a whole mess of them, indicating that someone had been using the spot for at maybe 2 to 3 weeks. But that wasn't what I found so disturbing, though. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a strange metal structure, almost like a cage, but not anything I could make sense of. It was about 4 square feet, constructed from metal bars that looked like they'd been welded together to form a crude cube frame. Obviously, I knew it looked enough like a cage to call it one, but the thing that didn't make sense is that it didn't seem to have any kind of opening. It looked like someone had purposely built that thing out there in the middle of nowhere, because no one in their right mind would have dragged that thing all the way out here, and it would also explain why they stayed in that one spot for so long. But then, why build it? And why not add any kind of door or hatch? I felt a chill go through me, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. Something about the entire setup, everything from the abandoned gear to the weird cage, it was enough to majorly give me the creeps. But there was one major problem. If you remember, with daylight dwindling, I'd been looking for a spot to camp. With the sun starting to set, I could either turn back, trying to hike out in the dark on a trail that I barely knew, or I could stay there, almost right next to the place that was giving me the creeps. It wasn't an easy choice, but in the end, I decided not to gamble on finding a new spot, and I set up camp right there. I didn't feel safe, at all, but the alternative posed a risk that I wasn't prepared to entertain. Yet even though I was fairly confident the cage builder wasn't going to return, there was a lot of trash but no tent, I felt on edge and I was constantly looking over my shoulder. The knife I carried was almost constantly in my hand, ready in case anything went wrong, but I still couldn't feel 100% safe, especially not after the sun went down. Every rustling noise, every snap of a branch in the distance made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, and that someone was watching me from the darkness. The night dragged on and I barely slept. I kept hearing things that sounded like footsteps in the distance or the sound of something moving through the snow, too far away to make out but close enough to send shivers down my spine. The fire flickered and crackled, casting long black shadows all around me, and it did little to calm my nerves considering the situation. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't care that I was still half asleep. I wanted out. I left the valley behind without a second glance, hiking back to my truck as fast as I could manage, and the entire time I couldn't shake the images of the abandoned camp, the strange clothes, and the piles of toilet paper, and most of all, that cage. It haunted me as I walked, and it still does. When I got home, I called the Forest Service and reported what I had found, and then sent them the pictures I had taken of the cage in the camp, hoping someone would be able to explain it. The ranger on the phone told me it was probably just some loner living out there, maybe someone trying to escape society and live off the grid or something. He also mentioned that it could have been the remains of an old moonshine operation or a pot-growing setup, though he admitted that the second option didn't seem likely for that area. I never went back to that spot. Part of me wanted to see if I could figure out what the cage was really for, but something in my gut told me that that wasn't a good idea. The woods aren't always empty, and sometimes the things you find out there are better left unexplained. But that cage, it still rattles around in my mind. I'll never forget it. Around twice a year, my wife and I like to drive our RV into the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. We usually make our one summer trip and one winter trip because my wife loves the snow, but last year was different. The snow started, then just didn't stop, and for 4 straight days, it fell without a break. And by day number 5, avalanches were coming down all around us, I'm not even joking. And a bad avalanche the previous winter had cleared huge sections of trees, and wildfires had burned through other areas we usually camp in during the summer. And with nothing left to hold the snow, the slopes gave way and the bare ground turned into rivers of snow and ice. And the route to the nearest town was blocked off. And although we had an alternate route and much longer route out of there, it seemed like only a matter of time before that got snowed over too, and so we decided to get the hell out of there while we still could. We started packing up our gear, trying to work quickly between the snow showers, and then as we loaded the last of our things, we heard it. The sound of yet another distant avalanche. We had become used to the noise by then, but obviously this time the situation was different. We were concerned it had blocked off our final route of escape, in which case we'd be stuck there until God knows when with only 2 days' worth of food in the RV. We ran to see where the snows had shifted, and we were relieved to see it wasn't anywhere near our route. But then seconds later, there was a scream. It was the single most blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard in my life, and I'll never forget how it echoed across the valley, sharp and long before just suddenly stopping. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that someone died that morning. The scream was full of fear and pain, and I felt it deep within my bones. My wife and I just stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed it, and we knew we had to do something, we just didn't know what. We couldn't tell where the scream had come from exactly, and the snow has a way of tricking you when it comes to how close and far certain sounds are. And so in the end, we went running out into the snow looking for somebody, anybody who'd be able to help. Luckily, we found somebody nearby with an ATV and a radio, and they used it to call for help. There wasn't much else we could do. The avalanches made it too dangerous to go searching any further ourselves, and once we knew help was on the way, and we figured that we were more than likely to get in the way than actually contribute, we decided to head home. During the very silent ride home, driving east on I-70, we saw more signs of destruction. Avalanches had hit the area hard, and as we drove through Glenwood Canyon, we missed another massive slide by maybe 40 to 45 minutes. This one was so strong it changed the course of the Colorado River and washed away the highway. Entire sections of road were just gone, swallowed by snow and debris. It made the landscape unrecognizable, like it was the end of days in my mind. Mother Nature was brutal that trip. She's a giving goddess, but Lord, does she know how to taketh away. She showed us her true power in ways I'd never seen before. The snow, the avalanches, the destruction. It's enough to make a man awestruck and make him feel small, insignificant almost. We were lucky to get away when we did, but I can't forget that scream. It plays in my head sometimes, sort of a reminder of how small and helpless we are in the face of nature's force. And that trip taught me to respect her power, and to never take safety for granted in the wilderness. Way back in 2015, myself and 2 friends of mine decided to go on a camping/hiking vacation on the PCT. We'd gone on a couple of camping trips before, but it wasn't until 2015 that we got the itch to do something a little more epic than just camping next to a lake and fixing some barbecue. We planned the trip for late winter, so the weather would be clear and the trails would be in good condition. Then after some discussion, we agreed on a starting point of Echo Lake near South Lake Tahoe, and then finishing at Donner Pass up near Truckee, which is about 70 miles and a total of 5 days hiking and camping. Since we'd be camping in Desolation Wilderness, we had to get permits ahead of time, but that was all relatively easy to arrange, and the allotted 5 days meant that we wouldn't require resupply and could avoid civilization for the entire hike. Everyone thought that we were nuts, because obviously a 70-mile week-long hike isn't most people's idea of a vacation. But by the time the date of the departure rolled around, I remember us all being raring to go. It wasn't just a chance to really test ourselves and all that other macho stuff. It was a chance to spend some quality time together. And as we got older, those chances were becoming fewer and further between. And so on the first day, we started at Echo Lake. The trail was beautiful right from the beginning, winding through 10 miles of alpine-like terrain before we arrived at Aloha Lake, which might be one of the most stunning places I've ever camped. The lake is surrounded by these dramatic granite peaks, and the water's so clear it's almost crystalline. It was the perfect spot to settle in for the night, and as we sat around the campfire that night, I remember thinking how the decision to go on that trip might have been one of the best of our entire lives. Day 2 was a little tougher, but again, it was 100% worth the effort. We covered 13 miles in total on the journey to Middle Velma Lake, and the highlight was definitely climbing up Dick's Pass. If you managed to read that without laughing, then I'm taking that as proof that you're AI. Just kidding. Dick's Pass was the highest point of the hike, coming in at almost 10,000 feet, so the views from the top were nothing short of unbelievable. It was very tiring, but every time we got close to exhaustion, someone would reinvigorate us by making a Dick's Pass joke, which to this day still hasn't gotten old. And after that, it was most definitely downhill toward the lake, where we found a peaceful campsite by the water. Thankfully, Day 3 proved much more relaxing. The trail went through forests and meadows, and I crossed a few small streams along the way, and it was one of those days where you can just zone out and enjoy being surrounded by nature. The trails were much easier than we expected them to be after Day 2, so we made it to Richardson Lake much sooner than we expected. We found the perfect spot to make our camp, made ourselves some dinner, and then passed around a canteen full of bourbon while soaking in the atmosphere before drifting off to sleep. On Day 4, we had covered 13 miles to Barker Pass, and without a doubt, that day was the most stressful. We had to walk up along these ridge lines above Lake Tahoe, which was hard going thanks to the accumulated fatigue of having been out there 4 days already. Then, despite the views of the lake being amazing, my fear of heights kicked in hard anytime I got close to the ledge and dared to peek over. To my relief, the trail even led down toward Barker's Pass, and I felt much more comfortable being on even ground. Then once we made camp, one of my buddies announced that he had a little surprise for us. He decided to keep it quiet until we were past the roughest sections of the hike, but he'd hidden away a little baggie of mushrooms in his pack. Now, he was into that kind of thing, psychedelics I mean, not in a big way, but enough for him to want to trip a little whilst out in the wilderness. However, the only reason he didn't just chew them up and swallow them without saying anything was he'd brought enough for 3. And I'd never done anything like that before. I don't turn down a cold beer at a barbecue, but I'd tried cigarettes and pot and hated both of them, so the idea of eating magic mushrooms in the middle of nowhere didn't exactly appeal to me at first. But then, after some discussion, I decided I'd take half. I don't know what measurement my buddy used, but he just gave me a clump of something dark and stinky and then told me to rip it into pieces before swallowing them all one by one with water, like little pills. He said if I chewed them, I'd puke, and the whole thing would be a waste, so I did what he said. Swallowed the little pieces of cap or stem or whatever it was and then waited for it to kick in. My buddy had assured me that I wouldn't go through anything remotely like how hysterical people described wild LSD trips. He said it'd be very similar to the feeling induced by pot, but much more intense and without the actual smoking part, which was the part that I really hated. He said I'd feel warm, fuzzy, giggly, and hungry, and he was exactly right. I guess it was because I was someplace so secluded, feeling totally uninhibited with 2 of my best friends, but it actually turned out to be a hell of a lot of fun. We came up and down the shore of the lake, howling at the moon, laughing our asses off, and by the time things started to wear off, I thought I'd gotten away with only one minor hallucination. There'd come a point where, while walking back towards camp, I kind of lagged behind my 2 buddies because I was looking up at the night sky. With zero light pollution, looking up at the night sky is trippy as it is, but on my little half dose of mushrooms, it was like seeing it for the first time. I remember feeling like almost a little freaked out because my brain was sort of like, what you are seeing is a 3-dimensional image, and I felt like I could see all the way out into the far frontiers of the universe. The next thing I know, I'm looking back down again, feeling almost dizzy, and as I try to get my eyes to focus, I see a figure, standing maybe 40 yards away. I immediately shout, "Hey, wait for me!" and I start walking towards them. But the figure turns and walks off in what I realized was the direction that we just come from. I then hear my buddies yell from behind, "Yo, this way, dude, come on." And just in case that wasn't clear, I was almost certain that I'd seen someone behind us. Well, when I stopped to really think about it, the figure had kept looking at me as they'd been walking away, like with their neck totally turned around, exorcist style. Seeing as that was completely impossible, all three of us decided that, yeah, I might have just suffered a very minor hallucination, possibly on account of how zapped my vision was after staring up into the night sky for a few minutes. It was weird, but kind of expected, and since we were all in such good moods, we just laughed it off excitedly before returning to camp and getting some much-needed sleep. The last day, I remember waking up feeling weirdly refreshed considering how we'd spent some of our night. But it was a very welcome feeling, because that final stretch was a whopping 19 miles to Donner Pass, and if we didn't make it, we were going to have to spend an extra night in the wilderness, which was obviously something we hadn't planned for. We had to start at 5 in the morning and maintain an uncomfortable pace while staying on the move almost constantly. But somehow, we made it. It was easily the hardest day of all 5. If we'd have known that the last one would have been so rough, we definitely would have left all the mushroom stuff to the final night. We might have started refreshed, but we ended up all blistered up and spent from covering 19 miles in a single day. Yet all that being said, reaching Donner Pass felt absolutely incredible. Granted, we'd fallen behind so badly that we had to walk 19 goddamn miles on that last day, but we set out on what we aimed to do in the time we laid out to do it. And as much as that wasn't exactly a Herculean feat, all three of us were very, very proud of ourselves. We found our final campsite, set everything up, and then went about rewarding ourselves by eating everything we hadn't munched through already as the sun set and darkness fell. At about 9:30, we were sitting around the fire contemplating retiring to our tents. Since it was coming to the end of the trip, we were starting to get pretty emotional. Not tear-shedding emotional or anything like that, but a lot of bromance style, like, "I love you, man," and that kind of stuff. Then, as we're still sleepily sitting around the campfire, talking back and forth, we hear footsteps coming at us through the trees, just beyond the light of our fire. As you can imagine, this had us all very nervous, but still much less nervous than if we'd heard 4 legs instead of 2. We knew it was a person, so when the man walked into our firelight, we weren't taken entirely by surprise, but we were still left wondering what he wanted, until he stopped and began to speak. Now, right away, we could tell just from the way the guy spoke that he was different. He talked like he had teeth missing, or like he had something wrong with his mouth, and as he got closer, we saw what it was. It looked like a section of his lower jaw was just gone, with one side of his cheek kind of concave and sunken, and he walked with a slight but very observable limp. He said, "Nice night for her, huh?" And after my buddy said, "Sure is," kind of nervously, the guy asked if he could join us round the fire for a few before he carried on his way. The guy looked to be alone, and although he looked a little sketchy with his grubby old clothes and his Sheldon from Big Bang Theory haircut, none of us saw the harm in letting him stay a while. One of my buddies asked him, "You a hiker?" And he replied, "I've been hiking around these hills my whole life," as he walked over and occupied a free space by the fire. And like I said, his clothes looked old and worn, and he had that weird high hairline haircut, but the creepiest thing about him were his eyes. I don't know exactly what was going on with his lower jaw, but if he'd been in an accident or if he was born that way or whatever, but I couldn't consider something like that creepy, just sort of unfortunate. But his eyes looked black as coal dust in the low orange light of the campfire. They were small, beady like a rat's eyes, and although they obviously weren't totally black, the way he squinted as he peered into the flames gave them a very unsettling, almost inhuman appearance. One of my buddies followed up his hiker question by asking if the guy lived around here, and he replied by saying that he and his family had lived out there a long, long time, drawing out the longs to make it sound as if they'd been there since the dawn of time. He said this while staring into the fire, giving me and one of my boys enough time to swap a look that said, "Uh-oh, this guy's gonna get weird, isn't he?" There was a brief pause, and then he looked up from the fire and asked us what we were doing out there. We just told him, not going into specifics of course, but enough to know that we were camping out there. He then asked if we were armed. To cut down on all the paperwork and whatnot, only one of us had applied for a DW firearms permit, which obviously meant only one of us could carry. But then, to cut down on the overall weight that we were carrying, our gun guy picked the smallest, lightest weapon he could get his hands on, and that wasn't just some pop gun 22. So while we were technically armed, we didn't exactly go advertising that only one of us was packing, and only something small at that. The guy knew straight away, though. As soon as my buddy said, "Yeah, we're armed," he started looking around as if to be like, "Oh yeah? Where are your rifles?" We didn't have to say anything to prompt my buddy to tell him that he could only get a pistol permit, and I figured that we were about to get a lecture on how you should always carry a long gun while you're out in the wilderness. But the dark-eyed man just sort of laughed quietly, then stared off into the fire in silence for a second before asking, "Y'all been telling any campfire tales?" Now, seeing as we were closer to 30 than 12, we hadn't been telling any campfire tales, and since we'd known each other since middle school, me and my two buddies did a fair bit of reminiscing, telling stories from our teenage years and whatnot. But we weren't talking about Bloody Mary, or telling stories about hook-handed killers or women in white. We didn't even think of telling any spooky tales around the fire, and especially not when we're on a bunch of magic mushrooms. So that's what we told him. No campfire tales for us, and he then asked if we wanted to hear one. He looked over the fire at us, smiling this crooked smile as he waited our answers. Me and my two buddies then sort of looked at each other and then told the guy, "Sure, why not?" And the guy starts by telling us that it's a true story about a group of guys just like us who were out on a hiking trip along the PCT. The three friends walked for 3 days, then on the 4th night, the three dumbass city boys got drunk and started hooting and hollering down by the lake and disturbing the peace of the good folk who made their homes among the hills. And right there is where things got weird. As the dark-eyed man's descriptions of his characters grew progressively more contemptuous, I started to suspect that maybe he was talking about us. He was calling those three city boys sissies and queers and stuff like that, just pretending to live off the land while making a mockery of the way others were forced to live. But it didn't fully hit me that he was talking about us until he mentioned all the howling and screaming we did that night while we were on mushrooms. Now don't get me wrong, we were mad when we realized that he was calling us all types of terrible stuff, but there was something that kept our mouths shut and allowed him to carry on speaking. He has detailed knowledge of our trip, the number of days, the kind of terrain we faced. He hadn't just heard us that night while we'd been going crazy by the lake. This guy had been following us for days. But we'd also just hammered out 19 miles worth of hiking in a single day, which raised the question, how the hell had our limping friend been keeping up with us? And with all that going through our heads, we just kept our mouths shut and carried on listening to this guy's story, and by that point, he was very pleased with himself on account of our reactions. He starts laughing at us, at how mad we were getting and also how freaked out we all obviously were. But then the next thing, still in that roundabout way through telling his story, he starts talking about how dumb we are. He said how on their 5th night out in the wilderness, the three friends were sitting out by their campfire, being dumb as goddamn rocks because they weren't paying attention to their surroundings. And that's when this handsome stranger walks up to the boys and asks them to join by their fire. Seeing as these three are innocent as babes, they say, Sure, come join us, mister." And so the stranger walks over and explains what hollow-headed morons they are, who are lucky to even still be alive. He was laying it on real thick by the end of it, throwing in way more insults and jibes than the ones I listed, and we three were starting to get really sick of the guy and his story. One of my buddies was like, "All right, I heard enough, and I think it's time you moved along, mister." But the guy just ignores him completely and carries on talking about us like we're not even there. He does this for about a minute longer, then one of my buddies stands up, like an implied threat, and tells the guy to move along. The dark-eyed man stopped talking for a second, turned to look at my buddy, and then starts up again. He said the three dumb hikers got so pissed off with the handsome stranger telling them like it is that they even contemplated kicking the guy's ass. But that, according to the dark-eyed man, is when the three hikers realized that there was no way the handsome but clubbed-footed stranger had been following them, at least not alone anyway. And that's about the same time they realized that attacking the handsome stranger might not be a very smart move, Not if he had a bunch of his cousins waiting in the darkness just beyond the firelight, all with enough boom to send the hikers off to the big sleep without him even knowing what hit him. That's why, when the handsome stranger was done speaking, the three little hiker boys just sat there on their asses like three little bitches and watched the handsome stranger, whose family had lived in those hills for a long, long time, stand up and walk away. Then to finish his story, the guy says, "See you around, boys." Then just gets up, and just like the story, walks off without ever looking back at us. But then, as he's walking away, we don't just hear his footsteps. We hear what could have been a dozen more, all walking within earshot after he disappeared beyond the firelight. We didn't sleep there that night. With a gun at the ready, we walked out of there with our flashlights in hand and walked a few more miles before we felt safe enough to pitch our tents again. But even so, we still couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I was pretty young when I went camping with my dad in Alabama during the winter. We'd set up camp late in the afternoon, and the fire had burned down to a few glowing embers by the time night had settled in. The woods around us were very silent, the usual rustling of leaves muffled by the frost, and everything felt eerily still. We were getting ready to crawl into our sleeping bags when we heard it. A low, bone-chilling rasping coming through the trees. At first, we just looked at each other. My dad tried to brush it off. "Must be the wind," he said, though his voice was a little tight, I think, and we listened for a moment, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing. But then it came louder, and louder this time. The sound was unmistakable, a very low, drawn-out groan that seemed to drift through the trees like it was carried on the wind. And then, one more time, a third one, so eerie that it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't normal. My dad grabbed the flashlight and I grabbed a big stick, following behind him like I was ready to defend him if something went wrong. We moved very cautiously. The cold air was stinging our face as we made our way through those woods. And eventually, we found her. A woman lying on the ground not far from our campsite. She was on a hill. Her head was facing downward and her feet uphill, and her body was still except for the occasional moan that escaped from her lips, and it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath around us as we watched. I felt an unease settle in my gut, the kind that you get when something doesn't feel right, but you can't put your finger on it. My dad knelt down next to her, shining the flashlight in her face. Her eyes were glazed over, unfocused, and her clothes were wet from the snow and cold, and when she spoke, her words were slurred, almost incomprehensible. We soon pieced together her story. She had been camping with her boyfriend, but they got into a fight. He'd driven off, leaving her alone in the woods with no way to get back to civilization. And in her drunken stupor, she had seen the last glow of our fire from a distance and decided to bring us the rest of her firewood. But in the icy cold, she tripped and fell, too weak to get back up. The groaning had been her only way to try and call out for help, but her condition made it hard for her to do much more than that. We helped her to her feet, though it was clear that she was in no condition to do anything but sit. We got her back to her campsite, making sure that she wasn't going anywhere in the dark, not that she really could have with alcohol clouding her senses, and told her to just wait it out until hopefully her boyfriend came back in the morning. It was a very strange moment, knowing that we had just stumbled onto someone who seemed to be lost in her own misery and maybe almost died as a result. And once we knew that she was safe, we returned to our camp, but I couldn't shake the image of her just lying there, groaning in the darkness, and who knows what would have happened to her. We were teenagers, 16 and 17, out camping alone in the woods. It was supposed to be a fun trip. We had made dinner, sat by the fire, and were enjoying the quiet evening by the river. But then, out of nowhere, some guy appeared. He was walking along the river with a fishing pole, looking like he was just passing through. He stopped at our campsite and asked if he could cut through to the road. We really didn't think much of it, so we said sure. He seemed harmless at first, just a guy looking for a shortcut, but then he sort of lingered. He started asking questions. How old are you? Where are you from? How long are you staying? And they seemed like normal, innocent questions, but something about the way he was asking made us uncomfortable. We were young and naive, and for some reason we answered. When he finally left, it seemed like a relief, and we didn't think much more about it. He headed down to the canyon, and we assumed that he was just gone for good. But a couple of hours later, he came back, this time with a friend. The two of them were middle-aged, probably in their mid-40s, and they didn't have any fishing poles this time. They didn't seem to have any reason to be there other than to get closer to us, and they started asking more questions. Where we were from, what are we doing out here, and how long are you staying? The original guy began wandering around our campsite, looking at our gear, poking around the edges of our tents. We both felt the tension in the air, a quiet unease that we really couldn't shake. It wasn't long before they left, but they didn't go back the way they came. Instead, they went up the canyon, deeper into the woods and out of sight. And that's when we started to feel something was wrong. As the hours passed and night began to settle in, the sound of the river became deafening almost. My friend mentioned that she couldn't hear anything around us because of the river, and it made her feel antsy. We talked for a while, and it quickly became clear that both of us had been on edge since the guys had left. The problem was, we never saw them head back down the canyon. We had no idea where they'd gone, and that feeling of unease kept creeping back into our minds. I can't really explain it, but both of us knew. We had to leave, and we had to leave now. It wasn't just the weird questions or the way they seemed to be sizing us up. It was the gut feeling that something wasn't right. We had both been alone and vulnerable in the woods, and we realized those guys had asked exactly the right questions to know that we were alone and unprotected that night. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe they were just some harmless hikers, or maybe they were just looking for company. But that feeling, that gnawing sense of danger, was too strong to ignore. We grabbed what we could, packed up as fast as we could, and left the campsite without looking back. We never saw those guys again, but I'll never forget that sinking feeling, the one that told us that we had narrowly escaped something we couldn't even fully comprehend. I don't know if they intended to harm us that night, but I do know that we were lucky to leave when we did. About 20 years ago, I went camping in Pisgah National Forest. It was my first time trying to sleep in a hammock, and I didn't have a rain tarp yet, so I was completely exposed to the elements, save for my big sleeping bag. The trip was organized by a local camp, so I wasn't alone. There were about 6 other teens camping with me. One of the kids made a decision that would come back to haunt us, though. He figured, hey, chocolate isn't really smellable, right? And he left his chocolate bar in his pack, right next to mine, both of them tucked under our hammocks. You can probably already guess where this is headed. Now around midnight, I was startled awake when something began nudging the pack beneath me. My mind was too groggy to process what was happening at first. I thought it was just one of the other kids rummaging around in their pack trying to find something. I could feel the soft brush of the pack as it shifted around, and even the slight jostling of the hammock. But then, the bumping didn't stop. In fact, it kept pressing against me. I shifted my hammock, groggily thinking that it was just someone moving around in the middle of the night, and that's when I felt it. Something bigger than a kid brushing against the side of my hammock. I was just about to ask what was going on when I heard a low rustling sound. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up with what was happening, and then I felt the unmistakable weight of a large animal pressing against the side of my hammock. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. A juvenile black bear no more than a couple of feet away had wandered into our campsite. It was sniffing around, clearly after that chocolate, and was so close that I could feel its back bumping against the fabric of my hammock with every movement. The bear must have realized that the hammock was moving because it suddenly reached up with one massive paw and gave the hammock a swipe, like a cat batting at a string. The force of the swing sent my hammock rocking, and I was thrown into complete panic, and I finally screamed, loud. I knew immediately it wasn't another camper. It was a bear. The rest of the campsite woke up in an instant, and we scrambled, yelling and throwing rocks at the bear until it finally ran off into the dark woods. My heart was still racing long after that bear disappeared, and all I can think about was how close I came to being swatted, or worse. The kid who'd left his chocolate out learned a hard lesson that night. He received a severe punishment, but honestly, we were all just relieved that the bear didn't decide to stick around any longer. And after that, I never forgot to take care with food in bear country, and I never camped without a proper rain tarp again. The snow started falling harder just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. We were camping in the forest, my friend Jake and I trying to enjoy one last trip before winter truly set in. We didn't expect the weather to turn so quickly, though. The forecast had called for light snow, nothing more. We'd set up camp near a small clearing, but when the snow began to fall heavier, Jake decided to gather more firewood before it got dark, and I stayed behind to get the fire going. He didn't come back, though. And at first I thought he was just taking his time, but as the minutes dragged on, I started to worry. I shouted his name into the trees, but the thick snow seemed to muffle my voice, and there was no reply. I grabbed my flashlight, and I decided to go look for him. I figured that he couldn't have gone far. The snow was coming down in these thick sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I called out for Jake again and again, but the only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. My flashlight beam wavered as I stumbled over roots and rocks buried under the snow, and the cold began to seep into my gloves and boots, and my toes and fingers started to feel numb. I had no sense of direction. Every tree looked the same, and the snow had covered our tracks. I turned in what I thought was the direction of the camp, but it was useless. The forest had swallowed me up. After what felt like hours of walking, my flashlight started to flicker, and panic clawed at my chest. I shouted Jake's name again, but my voice cracked and faded, and I was alone, lost in these freezing woods. The cold was getting worse. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my breath came out in these sort of ragged clouds. My body felt heavy, and my legs were weak, and I knew the signs of hypothermia, but there was nothing I could do. I had no shelter, no warmth, and no idea where I was. I kept moving, though my steps were slow and unsteady. I tripped and fell into the snow once more, each time struggling to get back up, and my wet clothes clung to my skin, sapping what little heat I had left. My head was pounding, and my thoughts were slow, like my brain was sort of freezing along with my body, and I started to see things in the trees. Shadows that moved, shapes that weren't there when I blinked. I knew it wasn't real, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The wind sounded like whispers, but I couldn't make out the words, and at some point I just collapsed. My legs couldn't carry me any further. The snow was soft, and in some ways comforting, and I felt an overwhelming urge to close my eyes. Just for a moment, I thought. Just to rest. But I knew if I fell asleep, I wouldn't wake up again. I forced myself to crawl, dragging my body through the snow. My hands were so numb I couldn't feel them anymore. My vision blurred and my chest burned with every breath, and my mind drifted in and out of clarity, thoughts just completely scattered. And I began to recall random memories, faces of family and friends, moments that seemed so far away now. I don't know how long I crawled. Time pretty much lost all meaning in that moment. The snowstorm felt eternal, an unending sea of white and gray, and my body screamed for rest and my mind just begged for warmth, and I began to feel a mix of hope and despair. Then in the distance, a sort of faint glow. At first I thought it was another hallucination, a cruel trick of my freezing mind, but as I squinted, the light stayed steady. It was warm and golden, cutting through the gray and white of the storm, and hope surged in my chest, giving me just enough strength to keep moving. The light led me to a small wooden building, a ranger station. Smoke curled from the chimney and the windows glowed with the promise of warmth, and I used the last of my strength to bang on the door before collapsing against it. I don't remember much after that. The door opened and someone pulled me inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, painful at first, but I didn't care. I was alive. Voices buzzed around me, hands wrapped me in blankets, and someone pressed a hot drink to my lips. I sipped it slowly, my body trembling as it started to thaw. The heat coursed through me, but it came with sharp, stinging pain as my numb extremities began to regain feeling. "You're lucky," I heard someone say, and my vision cleared slightly and I saw a man, likely a ranger, kneeling beside me, and his eyes were filled with some concern. "You're lucky you found this place. Another hour out there and it might have been too late." It took hours before I could speak. My voice was hoarse, my throat dry. I managed to tell the ranger about Jake, and he nodded. "We'll get a search party out at first light," I remember him saying. And I spent the night in the station wrapped in a layer upon layer of blankets, and the fire crackled, a comforting sound that felt like a lifeline, and sleep came in small bits. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that forest again, all the endless snow, the shadows that moved where they shouldn't. Morning came, and true to his word, the ranger had organized a search. I insisted on going with him, even though I was still weak. We combed the area, calling out for Jake, and hours passed, and I felt the weight of a dread grow heavier with every step. And we did finally find him. He'd made a shelter under a fallen tree, using branches and his jacket to create a crude barrier against the cold. He was alive, though his face was pale and his lips blue. He'd managed to keep a small fire going, but it was clear that he'd been on the edge, just like me, and relief washed over me. The embrace felt like a scar on both of us. Even though I can't forget the feeling of the cold, the weight of the snow, and the shadow in the trees, the forest doesn't feel the same anymore. It's beautiful, but it's also deadly. And Jake and I haven't gotten camping since. Sometimes when the snow starts to fall, I feel a shiver that has nothing to do with the cold. It's a memory, the echo of a night when nature showed me just how small and fragile I truly am. During October of 2024, 35-year-old father and self-employed contractor Dustin Mitchell Yersom ventured into the remote Moose Creek area near Big Sky, Montana, intent on a few days of solo camping. Dustin had long been a passionate advocate of outdoor pursuits and had managed to convince a friend to join him during the final few days of his trip. However, on October 12th, when he failed to meet a friend as planned, concern quickly grew. Dustin's friend went looking for his campsite, then, following a few hours of searching, he made a horrifying and heartbreaking discovery. Dustin was still lying in his tent, bloodied, torn up, and lifeless. The initial assumption was that he had fallen prey to a bear attack, a plausible scenario in Montana's wilderness. However, as investigators from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office delved deeper, inconsistencies emerged. There were no signs of bear activity in the vicinity, and the nature of Dustin's injuries did not align with those typically inflicted by wildlife. An autopsy revealed that he had suffered multiple chop wounds, including severe trauma to the skull, conclusively ruling his death a homicide. With the revelation of foul play, the investigation took on a new urgency. Detectives faced the daunting task of piecing together the events leading to Dustin's death. The remote location of the campsite, coupled with limited cell service, posed significant challenges. Authorities appealed to the public for assistance, particularly seeking information from anyone who had been in the area or possessed trail camera footage that might offer clues. On October 30th of 2024, a significant breakthrough occurred. Gallatin County Sheriff's Office announced that they had identified a suspect in Dustin's murder. The individual, already in custody on unrelated charges, was cooperating with detectives. Sheriff Dan Springer expressed confidence in the progress of the investigation, stating that the suspect had led investigators to crucial evidence. While the suspect's identity was not immediately disclosed, authorities assured the public that there was no ongoing threat, encouraging the community to continue their outdoor activities without fear. Further details emerged revealing the suspect as 41-year-old Darren Christopher Abbey. Abbey confessed to the heinous crime, admitting that he had encountered Dustin at the campsite, where Dustin had extended a friendly welcome, even offering him a beer. In a shocking portrayal of this hospitality, Abbey attacked Dustin, striking him in the head with a piece of wood, stabbing him in the neck with a screwdriver, and inflicting additional wounds with an axe. He then attempted to conceal his involvement by removing evidence from the scene, including the axe, a shotgun, a revolver, and a cooler. Abbey's motive for the unprovoked attack remains unclear. Dustin's tragic death sent shockwaves through the local community. Known for his love of the outdoors and dedication to his family, he left behind a young daughter and a stepson. His family and friends remembered him as a loving father, brother, and a son whose life was senselessly cut short. A memorial gathering was held on October 25th of 2024 at Headwaters State Park, where loved ones shared stories and paid tribute to his memory. As the legal process unfolds, the community remains united in their pursuit of justice for Dustin. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office continues to work diligently to ensure that all aspects of the case are thoroughly investigated, aiming to provide closure for Dustin's family and to uphold the safety and security of the community. Dustin's tragic end serves as a stark reminder of the potential dangers that can lurk even in the most serene settings. While the wilderness offers solace and adventure, it also demands vigilance and caution. This incident has prompted many outdoor enthusiasts to reassess their safety measures and to remain ever aware of their surroundings, even in the company of those who initially appear friendly. The senseless murder of Dustin Mitchell Yersom has left an indelible mark on the Big Sky community. As authorities continue to piece together the events that led to his untimely death, the community stands in solidarity with his family, honoring his memory and advocating for justice. Dustin's love for the outdoors and his generous spirit will be remembered by all who knew him, even as they grapple with the profound loss and the unsettling reality that such evil can manifest in unexpected places. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.